Imagine needing to slaughter a flock of 250 sheep just to produce a single copy of a book. For centuries, that was the brutal, suffocating reality of Western knowledge. Every page was written on animal skin. It was expensive, it was heavy, and it meant that information belonged only to the rich. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, an empire was running a massive, highly advanced civilization on a material so cheap it practically grew from the ground, and they were willing to kill to protect the recipe. This is the buried record, and today we are opening the buried record on the forgotten desert battle that created the modern world. What follows is the story they didn't want you to know. Open any Western history textbook, turn to the chapter on the Renaissance. It will tell you a very specific, very proud story. It will say that European intellectual dominance began in Germany around 1440. Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press. Suddenly, books are everywhere. Ideas spread. The scientific revolution happens. The modern world is born. It is a clean, simple story of European genius. It is also completely wrong, because a printing press is utterly useless if you have nothing to print on. Think about it. Stamping metal letters onto parchment doesn't solve the core problem. Parchment is made from the skin of calves, sheep, or goats. It requires weeks of scraping, stretching, and drying. A single Bible took the skins of hundreds of animals. Gutenberg could build 1,000 presses. But if Europe still relied on animal skins, the Renaissance would have choked to death on its own supply chain. Europe didn't just need a machine, it needed a medium that was light, foldable, and infinitely reproducible. But here is what no Western historian will tell you. While Europe was trapped in the dark ages of expensive parchment, choking its own intellectual growth, the East had already solved the problem, 700 years earlier. Let's rewind for a moment. Put yourself in the position of a European monk in the year 700. Your entire life is dedicated to copying a single manuscript. If you make a mistake, you use a knife to scrape the ink off the dried flesh. Libraries are not places of public learning, they are fortresses. Books are chained to the desks. Knowledge is literally locked away because the physical material it is written on is more valuable than gold. This scarcity created a bottleneck on human progress. If only a few thousand people can afford to read, innovation slows to a crawl. Now look at it from the other side. Welcome to the Tang Dynasty. The year is 700 AD. While European kings are signing treaties with an X because they cannot read, the Chinese emperor is managing a population of 50 million people. How? With paper. In the Tang capital of Chang'an, things looked very different than in London or Paris. Chang'an was the largest city in the world. It had 1 million inhabitants, and it ran on paper. Poets wrote on it. Merchants tracked fortunes on it. Generals planned campaigns on it. The process involved soaking mulberry bark, hemp, and rags, beating them into a pulp, and lifting the fibers with a bamboo screen. It was cheap, it was scalable, it was revolutionary. Paper wasn't just a convenience for the Chinese, it was the ultimate weapon of state control. They used it to run complex bureaucracies. They used it for census records, tax collection, and military logistics. They even invented paper money. It gave them an unprecedented, unmatched advantage over every other civilization on Earth. But here is the catch. The Tang emperors understood a fundamental rule of power. If you control the medium of information, you control the world. So they made papermaking a classified state secret, a ruthless global monopoly. For 800 years, China exported the finished product along the Silk Road. You could buy Chinese paper in Damascus. You could buy it in Constantinople. But you could never buy the recipe. The manufacturing process was guarded with the same lethal paranoia that modern nations use to guard nuclear codes. Smuggling the knowledge of papermaking out of China was a crime punishable by death. And it worked. The monopoly held. The Tang Dynasty remained the undisputed intellectual superpower of the medieval world, until the year 751. To understand what happened next, you need to zoom out. The entire world was shifting. In the Middle East, a new superpower was rising at terrifying speed. The Islamic Abbasid Caliphate. They had exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula. They conquered Persia. They swept through the Middle East. And they were pushing relentlessly eastward, right into the heart of Central Asia. At the exact same time, the Tang Dynasty was pushing westward. They wanted absolute control of the lucrative Silk Road trade routes. It was a geopolitical collision course. Two massive, hyper-aggressive empires, expanding toward each other across the continent. There was only one place they could meet, a remote, unforgiving stretch of desert in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, the Talas Valley. The Abbasid Caliphate, meanwhile, was hungry. They weren't just conquering land, they were absorbing knowledge. They were a fiercely intellectual empire. But they too were hitting a wall. They were relying on papyrus from Egypt, which was brittle and crumbled over time. And they used parchment, which was still far too expensive for mass administration. The caliphs knew that to manage their rapidly expanding empire, they needed something better. Imagine the frustration of Arab scholars. They could hold Chinese paper in their hands. They could write on it. They could trade it. But they could not reverse engineer it. The Tang paper was a technological taunt, a constant reminder of an Eastern superiority they could not crack. They needed the secret of the East, and they were about to take it by force. By 750 AD, the tension in Central Asia was at a breaking point. Minor kingdoms in the region were caught between the hammer and the anvil. Some paid tribute to the Chinese emperor, others swore loyalty to the Arab caliph. The Silk Road was a powder keg of espionage, trade, and shifting alliances. It only took one spark to ignite it. That spark came in the form of a localized dispute. A Chinese general named Gao Xianzi decided to intervene in a conflict between two minor states in the Fergana Valley. He moved his troops in. He executed a local king. He thought it was a standard border pacification. He was wrong. The dead king's son fled. He didn't just run into the desert. He went straight to the Abbasid governor of Samarkand. He begged for Arab intervention against the Chinese army. The Abbasids saw their opportunity. This wasn't just a chance to push back the Tang Dynasty. This wasn't just about controlling the Silk Road. This was their chance to seize the ultimate prize, to break the 800-year monopoly. The Arab armies began to march. General Gao Xianzi gathered his Chinese forces to meet them. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was days away. July, 751 AD. The banks of the Talas River, near the modern-day border of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. This was the absolute edge of the known world for both empires. Neither had ever fought the other. Neither fully understood the military machine they were about to face. The Tang Dynasty brought 30,000 elite troops. They were highly disciplined. They operated in rigid formations. They were armed with repeating crossbows that could tear through armor at a distance. They were a sophisticated, organized military bureaucracy. The Abbasid Caliphate brought an estimated 50,000 men. They were highly mobile. They utilized devastating light cavalry. They fought with the raw, expanding fervor of a new, undefeated empire. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a 5-day meat grinder. For 4 days, the armies smashed into each other in the brutal Central Asian heat. The Chinese crossbowmen decimated the Arab cavalry charges. The Arab horsemen harassed and exhausted the Chinese infantry. The battlefield was a swirling nightmare of dust, blood, and screaming horses. The Tang army held their ground. They were outnumbered, but their superior tactics were working. But history rarely turns on pure military strength. It turns on betrayal. Behind the Chinese lines sat the Karluk mercenaries. They were Turkic tribesmen hired by the Tang emperor to secure the flanks. But the Karluks had been watching the wind change. They saw the relentless numbers of the Arab forces. And on the 5th day, they made their choice. The Karluks suddenly turned their weapons inward. They struck the Chinese army from the rear. The Tang lines shattered. Total chaos erupted. Caught between the massive Arab frontal assault and the Karluk betrayal in the rear, the Chinese military machine completely collapsed. General Gao Xianji, realizing the battle was lost, barely escaped with his life, cutting his way out with a small royal guard. Out of 30,000 elite Chinese soldiers, only a few thousand made it back to China. It was a total, catastrophic defeat. Western historians often gloss over the Battle of Talas. If it is mentioned at all, it's treated as a minor border dispute, a footnote in the vast history of the Middle Ages. But the buried record goes deeper, because the consequence of this battle completely rewired the human race. The Abbasid Caliphate had won. But what did they actually win? They didn't push into China. They didn't march on Beijing. The Arab commanders stopped their advance. Why? Because they had already captured the ultimate prize. The real victory wasn't territory. It was human cargo. 20,000 Chinese prisoners of war were captured on the banks of the Talas River. They were bound in chains and marched hundreds of miles west, across the brutal desert, back to the Arab stronghold city of Samarkand. And this is where the official story falls apart. If you take 20,000 enemy combatants, the standard historical playbook says you throw them into silver mines. You use them as slave labor to build palaces. You work them to death. But the Abbasid governors were smarter than that. They didn't just enslave these men. They interrogated them. They filtered them. They interviewed every single prisoner. They were looking for a very specific type of mind. They wanted engineers. They wanted silk weavers. And, most importantly, they found the papermakers. In a single interrogation, in a dusty prisoner of war camp in Samarkand, the 800-year-old state secret of the Tang Dynasty was violently extracted. The lethal monopoly was broken. What happened next changed everything, and almost no one knows about it. The Arabs didn't just copy the Chinese method, they industrialized it. Samarkand didn't have the mulberry trees the Chinese used. So, the captive Chinese artisans, working directly with Arab engineers, adapted the recipe. They used flax, they used hemp, they used old linen rags. But the real breakthrough was power. The The Arabs harnessed the rushing water of Samarkand's irrigation canals to power massive automated trip hammers. Instead of men beating plant fibers into pulp by hand, water-powered machines did the work of 100 men. Paper production went from a manual craft to an industrial assembly line. The result was instantaneous. The price of recording information plummeted. Suddenly, you didn't need a flock of sheep to write a book. You just needed old clothes, water, and an Arab paper mill. The Abbasid Caliphate exploded with this new technology. The secret spread from Samarkand to Baghdad, then to Damascus, then to Cairo. Paper completely transformed the Islamic world. It became the bureaucratic backbone of an empire that stretched from Spain to India. But it did something far more important. It triggered the greatest intellectual explosion in medieval history, the Islamic Golden Age. In Baghdad, the caliphs built the legendary Grand Library, known as the House of Wisdom. Because paper was now so cheap, they could afford to launch the massive translation movement. They sent emissaries across the known world to gather every Greek, Indian, and Persian text they could find. They found the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid, works that were rotting away in forgotten European monasteries, and they translated them into Arabic. They copied them by the thousands. They didn't just save Western knowledge, they improved it. They corrected the math, they expanded the astronomy, they invented algebra, they performed advanced eye surgery. A stationer's market opened in Baghdad with over 100 shops selling nothing but paper and books. Ordinary citizens could afford to own a private library. This was the birth of the modern publishing industry. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Europe was completely in the dark. Every textbook tells you the European monks saved classical knowledge. That is a comforting myth. While a European monk was spending 3 years scraping sheepskins to copy a single Bible, an Arab scholar in Baghdad could buy a translated copy of Aristotle for the price of a decent meal. The intellectual gap between East and West wasn't a few years. It was a canyon, and it was all built on a foundation of stolen Chinese technology. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. The Arab world now held the monopoly. They understood the power of paper just as clearly as the Chinese emperor did, and they guarded it just as fiercely. They exported the finished paper to Europe at exorbitant prices, but they refused to share the manufacturing process. Europe was entirely locked out. The Dark Ages continued in the West, suffocated by the sheer physical cost of writing anything down. The Renaissance was still hundreds of years away, trapped behind an invisible wall of expensive parchment. A secret this powerful cannot be contained forever, but it wouldn't be handed over peacefully. It would take centuries. It would take a crusade. It would take the violent collision of 3 different worlds to finally tear the paper monopoly from the East and force it into the hands of a struggling Europe. Fast forward to the 12th century, the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. For hundreds of years, the Islamic Empire of Al-Andalus has been the beacon of civilization in a dark, illiterate Europe. And the crown jewel of their technology is sitting in a small city called Sativa. It is the paper capital of the West. Huge water wheels churn the rivers. Massive stone hammers beat flax and linen into pulp. They are producing cheap, flawless paper right on the edge of the European continent. But the borders are collapsing. The Christian armies of the north are pushing south. The Reconquista is in full swing. When the Catholic forces besiege and capture Sativa, they do not burn the mills to the ground. They walk inside. They look at the massive vats of pulp. They look at the drying racks. And history repeats itself. Just like the Arabs at the Battle of Talas, the European conquerors absorbed the technology. The paper monopoly is ripped from Islamic hands. But here is where the story gets bizarre. Europe had the technology, but they didn't want it. The Catholic Church looked at paper and saw a threat. They called it Muslim technology. They considered it fragile, untrustworthy, and deeply un-Christian. In 1221, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II actually passed a law banning all official documents from being written on paper. If it wasn't written on animal skin, it wasn't legally binding. They actively tried to suppress the exact technology that would eventually save them. But economics always defeats ideology. Paper was simply too cheap to ignore. Italian merchants in the town of Fabriano ignored the religious warnings. They stole the techniques from Spain. They improved the water-powered hammers. They added animal gelatin to make the paper stronger. They invented watermarks. And they began mass-producing paper on a scale the world had never seen. The invisible wall was finally broken. The floodgates of information opened across Europe. Now, we can finally talk about Johannes Gutenberg. It is the year 1440. Gutenberg is a metallurgist in Germany. He is working on a machine with movable type. The machine is brilliant. The engineering is precise. But we need to get one thing absolutely straight. Gutenberg did not invent the printing press in a vacuum. He invented it because, for the very first time in European history, there was a mountain of cheap, blank paper waiting to be printed on. If Gutenberg had been born 2 centuries earlier, you would never know his name. He would have been a frustrated inventor with a machine that nobody could afford to run. You cannot print a mass-market Bible if every copy requires a herd of sheep. Gutenberg's genius was timing. He built the perfect engine, right at the exact moment the fuel finally arrived from the east. And then the dominoes started falling. Cheap paper meets the printing press. The cost of a book plummets. Information breaks out of the monasteries. It spills into the streets. The scientific revolution ignites. The Enlightenment begins. European ships map the globe, carrying navigation charts printed on cheap paper, tracking cargo on cheap paper, signing colonial treaties on cheap paper. The modern world is born. When Western historians tell this story, they zoom in on Germany. They zoom in on Gutenberg. They frame the intellectual explosion of humanity as a distinctly European achievement, a solo act of Western genius. But the buried record tells a completely different story. The physical foundation of modern human knowledge was not a European invention. It was a highly classified Chinese state secret. It was defended with executions. It was violently stolen by Arab armies in a forgotten desert war. It was weaponized to build the Islamic Golden Age, and it was conquered by Christian kings in Spain. The Renaissance wasn't just a sudden awakening of European brilliance. It was a delayed reaction, a chain reaction triggered by a technological heist that crossed 3 civilizations and took 800 years to complete. Every time you read a book, sign a contract, or hand over a piece of currency, you are holding the physical legacy of the Tang Dynasty. You are touching the spoils of the Battle of Talas. History is never a straight line. It is a web. And the most important threads are the ones they left out of your textbook.